The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above the fourth-floor cardiac unit at Seattle General, a sound like electricity praying. Natalie Hayes initialed the medication log with a ballpoint pen, her fingers moving across the chart with the precision of someone who'd memorized every procedure, every protocol, every way a body could betray itself under stress. The pen didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. But there was something in the way her fingers pressed against the paper, muscle memory encoded so deep it had become invisible, the kind of muscle memory that came from holding a wounded Marine's tourniquet tight while rounds pinged off concrete walls in Ramadi. She was wearing her scrubs today, the pale blue ones that made her look like every other nurse in this hospital. Unremarkable. Forgettable. The brown hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked regulation issue, though no one in civilian nursing wore it that way anymore. The scar tissue on her left shoulder, a souvenir from a ricochet that had missed everything important by half an inch, was hidden beneath the cotton fabric. No one had asked about it in 8 months. No one had asked about much of anything. That was the entire point. The medication log lay open on the desk at the nurse's station, fluorescent light washing out the contrast. She initialed N. Hayes. 8 months of the same signature. 8 months of being exactly nobody in particular. Her eyes tracked the vital signs on the monitor: blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, numbers that meant everything and nothing at all if you didn't know what to do with them. She did. She'd known since she was 23 years old, and the Navy had taught her how to keep people alive in the worst places on Earth. Admiral Marcus Webb was in room for 12, the corner unit with the view of the parking lot and the city beyond. He'd been admitted 2 weeks ago with complaints of dizziness and mild confusion that had progressed into something darker, something that made his roomy eyes lose focus mid-sentence. The dementia had come fast, faster than anyone expected for a 71-year-old with no prior cognitive decline. The neurology team was still running tests. The real reason he was here, the reason Natalie had been transferred to this unit exactly 8 months ago, was something else entirely. Something classified. Something that meant she couldn't tell anyone that Captain Marcus Webb, retired, United States Navy, former commanding officer of SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, had been exhibiting early signs of cognitive decline that could potentially compromise sensitive operational knowledge from 3 tours in Iraq. She pushed the medication cart down the hallway, wheels squeaking against linoleum that smelled of antiseptic and industrial floor wax. The sound was soft, almost apologetic. The nurse's station fell quiet as she passed. She didn't look up. She never looked up. Room 412's door was open. Admiral Webb sat in the recliner by the window, morning light catching the loose skin around his neck, his hospital gown draped over shoulders that had once carried the weight of 100 men's lives. His left forearm rested on the armrest, the skin age-spotted and thin. There it was, all the tattoo. N. Hayes. The letters in a military font, faded now by 15 years of sun and time, still legible in the way that meant something to him once. The way that probably meant nothing to him now. "Morning, Admiral," Natalie said, and her voice came out soft, deferential, the voice of someone who'd learned long ago to take up as little space as possible. "Time for your 9 o'clock medications." He looked at her. His eyes moved across her face with the mechanical slowness of someone trying to process something just outside recognition. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of Marines who'd taken too much concussive force, in the eyes of soldiers who'd been in the heat too long. But she'd never seen it in the eyes of someone who'd once called her Reaper 6. "My apologies, Doctor," he said, his voice thin but still carrying that military clip, that precision of speech. "I'm not quite certain." "Nurse," she said quietly. "Not a doctor. Just here with your medications." She prepared the pills in the small paper cup, digoxin for his heart, lisinopril for his blood pressure, aspirin because he was 71 with a cardiac history. Her movements were economical. Efficient. The kind of efficient that came from training, not from best practices seminars. She handed him the cup and watched him take them, watched his throat work, watched the moment his eyes lost focus again and he looked out the window at the parking lot below. "Has anyone ever told you," he said slowly, "that you look familiar?" "No, sir," Natalie said. "First day for me on this floor." It was her 247th day. She left before he could ask anything else, pushing the medication cart to the next room, and that's when she felt it, the weight of a gaze from across the nurse's station. Dr. Pierce stood there with his arms crossed, his white coat pristine and expensive, the kind of white coat that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He was watching her with the calculating expression of a man who'd noticed something that didn't quite add up. Not everything. Not yet. Just something. Dr. Marcus Pierce was 46 years old, Harvard Medical School, a cardiac surgeon who'd been chief of cardiology at Seattle General for 7 years and had spent those 7 years building a reputation as the most brilliant and most ruthless physician in the state. He had connections, a brother-in-law who was a federal judge, a golf membership at the country club where the hospital board members held their weekend retreats, and the kind of institutional power that came from knowing which palms to grease and which people's careers could be quietly derailed if they started asking questions about billing codes or procedure records. Natalie didn't know about any of this yet. She just saw a man in an expensive coat watching her with narrow eyes. She checked the next patient, Mrs. Chen, 63, post-cardiac catheterization, recovering well, and initialed the medication log again. Natalie Hayes. The pen moved with that same steady precision. Not a tremble. Not a hesitation. She'd been trained not to hesitate. Hesitation got people killed. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical hum. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. A doctor's voice called out something about a consult. The hospital moved around her like water around a stone, and she moved through it like a ghost, the kind of ghost that took vitals and changed for bags and asked if patients needed anything else before slipping back into the background where nobody expected her to be anything more than exactly what she appeared. But in her jacket, the one hanging in her locker in the break room, the one she'd worn for 8 months without incident, there was something that contradicted all of that invisibility. A patch. Faded now, the colors bleeding into each other from years of sweat and sun and the dust of a city called Fallujah. The unit insignia from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Black and red. A horse rearing. Sewn into the jacket lining in neat, military stitches. Someone had taken time with those stitches. Someone had wanted that patch to stay exactly where it was, pressed against the chest of the person wearing it, close to the heart, impossible to see. She'd sewn them herself, the night before she reported to Seattle General 8 months ago. The morning shift continued its predictable rhythm. More patients. More medications. More vital signs entered into electronic records. More moments of invisibility. Dr. Pierce passed her twice in the hallway and didn't acknowledge her either time, though she caught the way his eyes tracked her movements with that same calculating expression. He was thinking about something. She didn't yet know what. By 11 o'clock, the unit had settled into its mid-morning lull. The phones rang less frequently. The emergency bells stopped calling. Natalie stood at the nurse's station and pulled up Admiral Webb's chart on the computer, her eye scanning through the neurological assessments, the cognitive decline markers, the lab work that showed nothing definitive but suggested everything troubling. The dementia was real. That much was certain. The question was whether it would progress quickly enough to become a security concern before the Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence could make a determination about what to do with the classified information in his head. That was her real job. Not the medications. Not the vital signs. Not the gentle professionalism with which she'd been trained to treat patients. Her real job was to watch. To wait. To be the invisible person in the room who was trained to recognize when a man's mind was slipping away from him. She didn't know that Dr. Pierce was watching her right then from his office, his door cracked just enough to see the nurse's station through the gap. She didn't know that he'd already started making phone calls. She didn't know that by the end of the week, her presence on this unit would become a problem he decided needed solving. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in room 412, Admiral Marcus Webb was staring at the tattoo on his own forearm, the letters N. Hayes, faded and impossible to read without holding his arm up to the light, and trying desperately to remember why those letters meant something. Why they felt like they should mean everything. And finding nothing in the fog of his mind but static. The Grand Rounds conference room at Seattle General held the clinical precision of a cathedral: white walls, fluorescent panels casting everything in shadowless brightness, 23 medical residents and attending physicians arranged in ascending rows like a surgical amphitheater. Tuesday morning. 0900 hours. Natalie stood at the back wall, her posture absolutely neutral, her hands folded at her sides with the kind of stillness that came from holding that position through 3 tours in Ramadi. Dr. Pierce stood at the front, patient charts fanned in his hands like evidence at trial. His voice carried the kind of authoritative warmth that made people believe him without question. This is what inadequate documentation looks like, people. Incomplete procedure notes. Missing timestamps. Substandard performance across the board. He held up a chart, her chart, turning it slowly so the residents could see the pages, could see her name printed on the front in hospital registration ink. These are the kinds of gaps that create liability. That suggest a fundamental lack of rigor. The residents snickered. Not loud. Just a ripple of dismissive amusement, the sound of people certain they'd never make such obvious mistakes. One of them, a fourth-year resident with a platinum watch that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly rent, actually shook his head. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't let a single muscle in her face acknowledge the humiliation washing across the room like a diagnostic wave. Instead, her mind was running calculations. Those procedure notes. Those gaps Pierce was highlighting. She'd reviewed those charts during her evening shifts. She'd watched the billing codes associated with them, the procedures that had never actually been performed, the surgeries that existed only in electronic ledgers and Medicare claims. A hernia repair. A carotid ultrasound. A bronchoscopy. All billed at $12,000 to $15,000 each. All phantom procedures. All part of a scheme that had to be worth, her mental mathematics clicked through like a mechanical calculator, somewhere in the range of $3, maybe $4 million over the past 18 months. Pierce's voice moved on to the next indictment, the next example of her incompetence, but her jaw tightened by maybe a millimeter. Just enough to feel like steel. The amphitheater dissolved. Residents scattered to their assignments. Natalie moved through the hospital corridors like someone walking through water that didn't quite resist her, her steps clicking on tile in a rhythm that belonged in a barracks drill. She reached the vending machines on the 3rd floor landing at 1,147 hours. She was reaching for a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, muscle memory from a life before Seattle General, when she heard Pierce's voice behind her, pitched to carry. Some people got their degrees online, I suppose. He stood 3 feet away, flanked by 2 board members whose names she'd catalogued, Hendricks from Finance, Margot from HR, community college nurses thinking they belong in a teaching hospital. The standards here used to mean something. He turned to look directly at her. Not with anger. With something worse, a kind of practiced disappointment, the voice of someone explaining why a child's drawing wouldn't be displayed on the refrigerator. His presence had the quality of something immense taking up space that should have been empty, like standing too close to a running engine and feeling the pressure wave change. She finished inserting her dollar bill. The machine hummed. The coffee dropped. She turned with the same expression she'd maintained since 0900, the same professional neutrality that had carried her through a casualty evacuation under small arms fire. The coffee here is terrible, Doctor. She said it without inflection. A statement of fact. But it's what we have. She walked past him without waiting for a response, the coffee cup warm in her hands, her gaze fixed on the corridor ahead. Behind her, she heard Hendricks say something quiet to Pierce. Pierce's laugh was careful, measured, the laugh of a man secure in his institutional power. By afternoon, he'd cornered her outside the supply closet on the 4th floor. The hallway was empty except for the hum of a ventilator somewhere distant, the rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor in a nearby room. He positioned himself between her and the door, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped around his neck like the collar of a regiment. Your performance review is Friday, Hayes. His voice was softer now, more intimate, the voice of someone delivering necessary bad news. I'm recommending termination unless I see dramatic improvement by week's end. Frankly, I'm not sure you have the capacity. Security can escort you out now if you prefer to save us both the trouble. His smile was perfect. Practiced. The smile of a man who delivered dozens of these conversations to people with less power than him, people who broke when the pressure came. He was waiting for her to crack. Waiting for tears, for anger, for anything to prove his thesis that she didn't belong here. She met his eyes with the same steady expression she'd maintained all day, jaw set, breathing controlled, hands absolutely still. Understood, Doctor. Her voice came out level. Professional. The voice of someone accepting an order, not a condemnation. I'll improve my documentation standards immediately. She waited until he stepped aside, then moved past him into the supply closet, her movements precise and unhurried. She reached for sterile gauze pads on the third shelf, her hands as steady as surgical instruments. Pierce lingered in the doorway for 5 seconds, maybe 6, waiting for something in her to crack. When nothing did, he walked away. By evening, Natalie was back in her apartment, a sparse one-bedroom in a complex that asked no questions and ran background checks that flagged nothing unusual. She sat on the edge of the bed she rarely slept in, her uniform hanging in the closet where it had hung for 8 months, and she pulled out her jacket from the bottom of her duffel bag, the same jacket she'd worn in Ramadi, the same one with the unit patch sewn into the lining. The patch was faded almost to illegibility, the edges frayed from 8 years of carrying it, its colors muted to shades of dust and time. She ran her fingers across the embroidered insignia, the symbol of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the call sign she'd carried through the worst year of her life. Around the edges were 12 names stitched in white thread. The Marines she'd failed to bring home. The ones who died while she was dragging someone else to safety. The ones whose mothers called her in the dark, asking how their sons looked at the end, asking if they'd said anything, asking if she'd made them suffer less. Admiral Webb's name wasn't stitched there. He'd lived. He'd made it out. He'd carried her name on his body for 3 years before the dementia erased her face from his memory, before he looked through her on every shift like she was just another nurse in scrubs, just another stranger in his fading world. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Pierce was right about one thing: her documentation was incomplete. Not because she was incompetent. Because she'd been running a medical intelligence operation inside this hospital's cardiology unit, and there were certain procedures she couldn't fully document without exposing why she was really here, without explaining that every detail she'd recorded about Admiral Webb's cognitive decline was going into encrypted reports that went to people with federal authority and classified clearance. Her incomplete charts were the tracks she'd covered. Her gaps in documentation were the line between her mission and her arrest. She placed the patch carefully back inside the jacket lining and hung it in the darkness of the closet. Muscle memory took over. She showered in water as hot as she could bear it, her scar tissue whitening under the heat, then lay in the dark without sleeping, her mind running through contingencies. If Pierce followed through with termination, she'd lose access to Webb's unit. She'd lose the ability to monitor his deterioration. She'd lose the only reason she was here at all. She couldn't fight back without revealing what she actually was. She couldn't explain her qualifications without exposing the operation. By midnight, she'd calculated the worst-case scenarios, the cascade failures, the domino sequences that would end in compromise or capture. None of them ended well. All of them ended with her mission terminated and her cover burned and classified intelligence potentially walking into hostile hands if anyone sophisticated enough decided to ask Admiral Webb the right questions. She stared at the ceiling and waited for Wednesday morning. The code bell screamed through the 4th floor at 08 for 7 hours on Wednesday morning, a sound that split the air like a surgical saw through bone. Natalie heard it from room 412 where she was checking Admiral Webb's morning vitals, his breathing shallow, his eyes unfocused as they always were now, looking through her like she was furniture. She didn't hesitate. The sound meant someone was dying, and her body moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory older than her nursing license, older than her cover, older than 8 months of playing unremarkable. She was in the hallway at a run, following the converging footsteps and the organized chaos that only happens when a human body starts shutting down. Room for 18. She could already hear the rapid response team assembling outside, residents calling out vitals that didn't make sense yet. They would, though. They always did if you knew how to listen. Natalie stepped into the room and her eyes went to the patient first, then to the monitors, then to the physical signs the machines hadn't caught yet. The man was a retired accountant named Robert Chen, 74, admitted 3 days ago with pneumonia that everyone thought was resolving. He wasn't resolving. He was dying. His neck veins were distended like purple ropes pulled tight under his skin. His right side of his chest rose and fell with each panicked breath, but his left side, still absent. Not moving. The left side wasn't breathing. Tension pneumothorax. A pocket of air in his chest cavity pushing against his lung, compressing his heart, filling the space where blood should move. Every breath he took was making it worse. Every second without decompression was a second closer to cardiac arrest. The residents hadn't caught it. The nurses stood frozen, waiting for the code team. The monitor was still showing a rhythm that looked almost normal if you didn't know what you were looking for. But Natalie knew. She had held a wounded Marine's chest in her hands in a compound courtyard in Ramadi while rounds snapped past her head like angry hornets, and she had felt his lung collapse exactly like this, and she had known in that moment that if she didn't decompress it, he would die in her arms. 14-gauge angiocath. Her voice came out level, not a question. A command. The charge nurse turned, startled. Natalie didn't usually speak in the code blue, and for a moment no one moved. Natalie was already moving to the bedside, her hand steady as surgical laser beams. She didn't ask again. 14-gauge. Now. A resident fumbled through the crash cart, pulling out the needle and catheter assembly. Natalie's fingers found the landmarks on Chen's chest, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomy as familiar as her own skeleton. She swabbed his skin with antiseptic, and the smell of it flooded her back for just a millisecond, not to Ramadi, but to the medevac tent where she'd done this for a sergeant with a sucking chest wound, her hand shaking then because she was 24 and terrified, before she learned that fear was just data you had to process and set aside. She wasn't afraid now. The needle went in with a small resistance, then a hiss. The sound of air escaping under pressure, 18 years of training and instinct moving through her fingers. The catheter followed, and the moment it was in place, the room changed. There was an audible release of air, a pressure equalizing, the sound like a tire losing its breath. Chen's oxygen saturation, which had been dropping toward the low 80s, paused. Then began to climb. 83. 87. 91. Get a chest X-ray, Natalie said, securing the catheter with practiced efficiency. And call for portable films. He's not stable for transport. The crash team burst through the doors at that moment, the attending physician a woman named Dr. Reeves who'd never worked with Natalie before. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard footsteps behind her, moving fast and deliberate. Dr. Pierce. Of course it was Pierce. He appeared at her elbow like he'd been waiting for this moment, and maybe he had been, because men like Pierce always knew where the opportunities were. Interesting, he said. No greeting. No acknowledgement of the fact that she'd just prevented a patient from dying in front of 20 people. Unauthorized procedures. Natalie kept walking. 4th floor, heading back to Admiral Webb's unit where she still had access, still had clearance, still had her mission. She had maybe 4 hours before Pierce weaponized this against her, before the chart review started, before the questions began about her training, her credentials, her authority to perform any intervention that wasn't explicitly assigned to her by a physician. That patient needed decompression, she said, her voice level as glass. The team wasn't here yet. Yes, well. Pierce matched her pace, his shoes clicking against the tile with the sound of money and certainty. We'll need to discuss exactly what your scope of practice includes. In my office. After your shift. After your shift. Not during. Not immediately. After, when she was tired and without witnesses and without the protection of the code blue environment where heroics were sometimes forgiven. Natalie understood the message. This wasn't over. This was only beginning. By the time she reached room 404, Admiral Webb's room, her mind was already running the calculations. The reassignment would come by end of shift, she could feel it coming like distant thunder. Pierce would move fast now because he'd watched her perform a procedure that made the residents look incompetent and the hospitals look good, and he couldn't have that. Competence was dangerous. Competence drew attention. Competence attracted the kind of people who asked questions. She entered Webb's room to find him sleeping, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical regularity of a patient in early recovery. She checked his monitors, checked his lines, checked everything with the same precision that had saved Robert Chen's life 40 minutes ago. Webb's pupils were dilated and fixed. His hands lay at his sides, empty of recognition, empty of the memory that had once made him reach for her in a Ramadi courtyard and say her name like it was the most important word in any language. The mission was still there. Webb was still there. But the clock had just started ticking faster. Natalie made a note in the electronic medical record about Webb's vitals, knowing already that her access to this system would be revoked before the day ended. She wrote carefully, documented meticulously, created a trail of evidence that she had been doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Her hands moved through the routine like they'd done it 10,000 times before, because they had, in 10,000 different versions of the world, in different uniforms, with different names, all of them driven by the same core purpose that had never changed. The charge nurse passed by the room and caught her eye. There was something different in that look, respect, maybe, or the beginning of respect. Natalie nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting it. She couldn't afford to accept anything from this hospital anymore. Everything that happened next would be used against her, scrutinized, questioned, dismantled by a man who understood that the best way to destroy someone wasn't to attack them directly, it was to make the institution turn against them, to bureaucracy them into irrelevance. The shift continued. The hospital moved around her like she was already a ghost, already gone. And Natalie Hayes, Captain, Navy Nurse Corps, moved through the corridors of Seattle General in Raleigh and waited for the axe to fall. The reassignment came on Wednesday afternoon in a single email. Dr. Pierce's words were carefully chosen, professional, clinical, beyond reproach. Effective immediately, Natalie's assignment had been transferred to the night shift in pediatrics. Not a conversation. Not a meeting. An email to her hospital account, copied to HR, to the charge nurse, to the credentialing office. The subject line read, Staffing Adjustment, Administrative. She read it twice while standing at the medication cart on the 4th floor, her hands steady as they had been in Ramadi, as they had been when she performed the needle decompression that had saved Admiral Webb's life. Muscle memory didn't just apply to trauma. It applied to absorbing catastrophic news with no visible reaction. She initialed the log. Moved to the next patient's chart. Nobody watching would have known her career was being systematically dismantled one keystroke at a time. By 1400 hours, the phone call came. Dr. Pierce himself, his voice smooth as oil on still water. Captain, sorry, Ms. Hayes, I'm reaching out personally because I care about your professional development. The words were a weapon. I've filed a request with the credentialing committee for an urgent review of your nursing licensure. Purely routine. Your documentation gaps, the incident with the Admiral's chart, the near miss with the medication protocol last month. Nothing to worry about. Just need to ensure we're meeting state standards. No mention of her needle decompression. No acknowledgement that she had kept a man alive when the entire code team was still 90 seconds away. The credentialing review meant scrutiny, background checks, possible suspension of privileges pending investigation. It meant her file being open to hospital attorneys, state nursing boards, possibly federal auditors depending on how deep Pierce wanted to dig. It meant exposure. By 16:30 hours, the access restriction appeared. She tried to pull up Admiral Webb's chart on the 4th floor computer terminal and encountered a blocked screen. Access denied, user account restricted by IT department. She tried her password 3 times. The same message each time, the red text on black background like a door slamming in her face. A young resident using the next terminal glanced at her with casual pity, just another nurse getting locked out of the system, happens all the time. Nobody understood that this wasn't a technical glitch. This was erasure. By 1645 hours, IT confirmed via email that her access to the electronic medical record system had been restricted pending the credentialing review. For your protection, the message read. For your protection. The words might as well have been a bullet. Natalie moved through Seattle General like a ghost that afternoon, a body occupying space in hallways she'd walked for 8 months, a face that belonged to someone else now, a failed nurse, a problem to be solved, a security risk being quietly removed from the board. She couldn't protest without a reason that would hold water. She couldn't explain that she needed to stay on the 4th floor because the man in room 4127 was a retired admiral with classified military knowledge and progressive dementia that could compromise national security. She couldn't say that blowing her cover meant mission failure. She couldn't tell anyone that the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one bearing the emblem of her Ramadi deployment, connected her to a wounded Marine who'd been bleeding out on that floor 17 years ago, a Marine named Marcus Webb, a Marine who'd survived because she'd carried him. Protest meant exposure. Exposure meant the intelligence Webb possessed would be vulnerable. The classified operations in Ramadi were still relevant. Enemy networks still operated on those same intelligence frameworks. Loose ends got tied up in dark rooms far from hospitals. She finished her shift at 17:30. Cleared her locker. Didn't look back. Thursday evening came with rain like thrown gravel against the bus shelter on Highland Avenue. 21:47 hours exactly. Natalie stood under the cracked plastic awning, water leaking through the seams, soaking the shoulders of her jacket. The cardboard box balanced against her hip was pathetic, the cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded lettering, a dying succulent with leaves like paper, a photograph of her unit in Ramadi. 14 faces in that photo. 6 were gone. The names on the memorial wall at Arlington. The names she didn't say out loud because saying them required breathing she didn't have. A sedan rolled up to the curb at precisely 21:50. No headlights. No music from inside. The window rolled down silently. The man behind the wheel wore the kind of face that existed in government buildings, blank as drywall, belonging to no country and every country simultaneously. NSA. Liaison to her actual command structure, not the hospital, not the nursing board, not any civilian authority that mattered. Missions compromised, he said. No greeting. No names. Webb's being transferred to Bethesda Naval in the morning. You're recalled. She nodded. You understand what that means. She understood. The cover was burned. The assignment was terminated. Her handler was telling her that the Pentagon already knew, that someone higher than Pierce had already moved on this. Webb was going to a secure military hospital where his dementia could be managed without civilian interference, without threats from greedy cardiologists, without her. The sedan drove away. She was still standing there, cardboard box growing heavier, when her phone rang at 22:04. The 4th floor charge nurse, breathing hard, words tumbling out like she was drowning in them. Miss Hayes, I know you're off shift but Admiral Webb is having another episode. He's combative, sedation isn't working. He's calling for someone, he keeps saying Reaper, he's saying he needs Reaper 6, he's lucid but he's calling for somebody named Reaper 6, we can't calm him down and Dr. Pierce is in the conference room with the board and I don't know what to do. The words punched through her chest like shrapnel. Reaper 6. Her call sign. The one she'd worn in Ramadi. The one embedded in the encrypted files of classified operations that had turned into dementia that was now surfacing, pushing through the fog in a man's deteriorating brain like a truth that refused to stay buried. I can't come, Natalie said. The words were true. She was terminated. Her badge would be revoked by morning. Security had orders to remove her. Going back meant confirming that Dr. Pierce had been right about her, that she had something to hide, that she wasn't who she claimed, that she belonged nowhere. Please, the charge nurse said. I don't know what he needs. He's asking for you. He says you know him. He says you saved him. Natalie closed her eyes. The rain hammered against the shelter roof like a drumbeat counting down time. She looked at the photo in the box, her unit, the Marines whose names were now just weight in her memory, the ones who'd bled out on dirt that would never wash clean. She thought of Webb's arm, the tattoo, the 3 letters that meant something, that were a receipt for a debt that never got repaid because debts to the living never balanced. She dropped the cardboard box into the trash bin beneath the shelter. The mug shattered. The succulent scattered across wet paper. The photograph floated on standing water. She walked toward Highland Avenue in the rain, toward the hospital that was 3 blocks away, toward the badge that was about to be useless, toward Admiral Webb who was asking for Reaper 6 at 0204 on a Thursday night that was dissolving into Friday. Security would try to stop her. Her access was revoked. The termination was official. Dr. Pierce had locked every door. She'd broken into more secure compounds than this. The employee entrance on the east side of the building had a scanner, not a human guard. Natalie held her badge to the reader at 0623 Friday morning, betting everything on the fact that system updates ran on a 90-minute delay. The light blinked green. The door unlocked. She moved through it like a woman who was already a ghost, who had nothing left to lose, who had finally stopped pretending to be anything other than what she was. The Pentagon call came through at 8:33 a.m. on Friday morning, routing through the hospital's main switchboard to the administrative offices on the 2nd floor. The woman on the line identified herself as Commander Sarah Holloway, Defense Intelligence Agency, and she asked to speak with hospital administration regarding a patient in the cardiology unit. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. Within 20 minutes, 3 men in dark suits were waiting in the conference room, and Admiral Webb's chart had been flagged for security review at the federal level. By 9:15 a.m., the page came through the overhead system. Natalie recognized the charge nurse's voice, urgent, but controlled. N. Hayes to Admiral Webb's room. Stat! The code wasn't for a medical crisis. The charge nurse had paged her 3 times in 8 months and Natalie had learned to read the difference between a patient emergency and an administrative summons. This was something else entirely. She was walking through the 4th-floor corridor before the page finished echoing through the speakers, her badge still dangling from her scrub pocket where it had been since she'd crossed back through the employee entrance an hour ago, unauthorized, using credentials that should have been deactivated. The hospital had 43 security cameras. She'd counted them her first week. When she entered Admiral Webb's room, the chart holder nurse was standing near the door with an expression that suggested she'd been briefed on something but not the full story. The Admiral sat upright in bed, actually upright, not the collapsed posture of the past 3 days when his dementia had rendered him docile and distant. His eyes were tracking her entrance with the predatory focus of a man who'd spent 30 years in military command. His trembling hand reached across the bedside table, not toward water or the call button, but toward her. Toward the name embroidered on her scrub pocket. Reaper 6, he whispered. The words were fractured, coming from somewhere deeper than language, from muscle memory older than his own forgetting. Reaper 6, you came back. The room compressed. The fluorescent panel overhead buzzed like a creature dying in slow motion, and Natalie moved to his bedside with the precise efficiency of someone who knew exactly what was happening and why it mattered. His left forearm lay exposed above the hospital blanket, and there it was, the faded ink she'd seen exactly twice before, the lettering that had survived 30 years of sun damage and age, N. Hayes, tattooed in military block letters, the kind of thing a career naval officer did to commemorate a life debt paid in blood and dust on the streets of Ramadi. She reached out, and her 2 reattached fingers traced the letters with the gentleness of someone reading Braille in the dark. "Admiral," she said quietly. "It's me." The door opened. A Marine colonel entered first, moving with the kind of economical precision that meant he'd been to places civilians didn't recover from. He was holding a blue folder, the kind that came from the Pentagon, the kind that contained the kind of truths that ended careers or saved them depending on which side of the paperwork you were standing on. Behind him came Commander Holloway, the woman's voice made flesh, steel-eyed, and 60 years old with salt in her hair that looked like earned rank. 3 hospital board members filed in behind them, and Natalie recognized 2 of the faces, the ones who'd stood at the vending machines while Dr. Pierce had calculated her destruction in real time. Captain Natalie Hayes, Navy Nurse Corps, the Marine Colonel began, opening the blue folder with the reverence of someone reading scripture. Assigned to DIA Counterintelligence Operations, December 2019 to present. Silver Star recipient for actions under fire extracting wounded personnel, Ramadi District, October 2015. 2 Purple Hearts. Naval Commendation Medal with Combat V. He paused. The silence carried weight. Medical discharge was falsified to provide cover for civilian assignment. Your documentation patterns in this facility triggered federal fraud detection systems designed to monitor billing discrepancies. You were flagged as a security asset, not a security risk. The board members were stone. Admiral Webb's eyes had filled with tears, the first coherent emotional response Natalie had witnessed in 3 days, and he reached for her hand again, gripping it with the desperation of a man whose memory had finally caught up to his body. The conference room doors burst inward with the kind of violence that comes from panic disguised as indignation. Dr. Pierce stood in the threshold, his face already flushed, his voice already climbing toward the upper registers of a man whose entire architecture of control was collapsing in real time. "This is highly irregular," he said, addressing no one and everyone. "Whatever story she's fabricated, I can assure you the credentialing committee will support my assessment of her performance as inadequate and..." Dr. Pierce, the FBI agent closest to him, held up a tablet, her voice carrying the flat precision of federal authority. "We need to discuss your database access from Wednesday evening." The blood drained from Pierce's face in a visible tide. The color started at his hairline and descended like water draining from a basin. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The agent continued without waiting for permission. "At 2147 hours Wednesday, you accessed the hospital's credentialing management system and attempted to alter Captain Hayes' employment record, fabricating disciplinary incidents dating back 6 months. You deleted your entry logs. Standard procedure when someone wants to hide their tracks." The second FBI agent stepped forward, opening a folder heavy with documentation. "Your deletions triggered federal fraud detection algorithms we've been running on Seattle General's billing infrastructure for 8 weeks. We found 847 procedures billed to Medicare that were never performed. 847, that's $4.7 million in fraudulent claims." "I was protecting institutional standards," Pierce said, and his voice had lost its weight. It sounded small. It sounded like what it actually was, the bleating of a predator who discovered the food chain had predators of its own. She was a security risk. Her documentation was inconsistent. She refused to comply with standard. "You were protecting a criminal enterprise," the first agent said, and she spoke with the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty. "When Captain Hayes' accurate documentation threatened to expose the procedural discrepancies in your billing patterns, you systematically attempted to terminate her employment and destroy her professional credentials. You documented it in the hospital system. You created a digital trail that proves premeditation. You attempted to forge official credentialing records." The second agent raised his hand, and the movement had the weight of ceremony. The handcuffs came out, stainless steel, catching the fluorescent light, clicking open with the sound of finality. They closed around Pierce's wrists with a sound like a door locking, and Commander Holloway recited the Miranda warning in a voice that suggested she'd done this before and would do it again. The board members stood motionless. One of them, the woman who'd laughed at the vending machines, who'd stood beside Pierce while he'd calculated Natalie's erasure, had her hand over her mouth. Pierce was led out through the 4th-floor corridor in handcuffs, his white coat still unbuttoned, his badge still swinging from his pocket as if he might still be a doctor here, as if the world hadn't just decided otherwise. The nurses' station fell silent as he passed, the residents who'd attended his grand rounds, who'd laughed when he'd held up her charts, who'd nodded along as he'd calculated her career destruction, they watched him go like a man walking toward an exit that didn't lead anywhere good. The perp walk made the security camera feeds. By noon, it was on every local news channel in North Carolina. Dr. Harrison Pierce, chief of cardiology, arrested on federal fraud charges. 6 months later, someone would spot him at a community college in Durham, teaching CPR fundamentals in a gymnasium, making $18 an hour, his medical license revoked as part of his plea agreement, his entire professional architecture reduced to teaching compressions to future paramedics who'd never know his name meant anything at all. But that wasn't what made the evening news. What made the evening news was what happened in Admiral Webb's room at 2:13 p.m. that same Friday afternoon, when the Pentagon liaison finished briefing the hospital board on what Natalie's actual assignment had been: monitoring a retired admiral's cognitive deterioration in real time, filing classified reports through secure channels, watching for signs that his memory of Ramadi operations might become a security vulnerability if his condition worsened without proper oversight. Her substandard documentation had been intentional. Every gap in her charting corresponded to information she was reporting through channels that didn't exist in any hospital database. She was a nurse. She was also something else entirely, and the institutional machinery that had tried to destroy her was finally, irreversibly, understanding that distinction. Admiral Webb struggled to his feet in his hospital gown, a move that should have pulled his full lines, that should have triggered alarms, but the Marine colonel simply nodded at the nurse moving to stop him. Webb stood at attention, his frame trembling with the effort, his eyes locked on Natalie's with the clarity of a man who'd recovered something he thought he'd lost to the fog. He raised his right hand to his forehead and held it there, not the casual gesture of military protocol, but the full, shaking salute of someone who understood exactly what he owed and to whom. The kind of salute you gave to someone who'd dragged you out of the fire. Natalie returned it, her fingers, the two that had been reattached, the two that had nearly cost her everything, perfectly aligned. The image would be broadcast across every news station by evening: Admiral Marcus Webb, lucid for the first time in 72 hours, saluting the nurse who'd saved his life twice. Once in Ramadi, under fire, when the dust was still settling and the screaming hadn't stopped. Once in Raleigh, in a hospital where everyone had been too busy to understand what was happening. The news anchor's voiceover would explain the unit patch, the call sign, the mission. It would explain why a nurse with perfect composure had never flinched while the hospital watched her save a man's life and then tried to destroy her for it. It would explain silver stars and purple hearts and the kind of heroism that wore scrubs because that was where the mission required her to be. 3 weeks later, new orders arrived. A new assignment. A new hospital in a new city where her competence would again need to be invisible, where her excellence would need to hide behind the same perfect composure that had carried her through 8 months of humiliation and institutional cruelty. Natalie packed the same cardboard box, the cracked world's okayest nurse mug, the photograph of her unit from Ramadi with half the faces now gone, the dying succulent that she promised herself she'd remember to water this time. Before she left Seattle General for the last time, she moved to her locker and removed the faded unit patch from the bottom, the one she'd sewn inside her jacket lining all those months ago when she'd needed a reminder of what she actually was beneath the cover. She looked at the embroidered call sign, Reaper 6, and she thought about Admiral Webb's hand trembling as he reached for her, about the moment when his memory had finally caught up to his heart. She sewed the patch back into place with stitches that were precise and careful and permanent, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd been doing this same work for more than a decade. The needle went in. The thread pulled tight. The names stitched into the fabric, the ones who'd come home and the ones who hadn't, they were still there, still part of her, still worth carrying. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. But sometimes the world does watch. And sometimes, when it does, it finally understands what it's been looking at all along. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.